happens to a house when it is left alone, when it becomes worn and aged, when its paint peels and its foundations begin to sink.
Welcome back to Halloweeny Spooky-ish Games Month, where this week we're looking at Anatomy. Released back in February of this year on itch.io, Anatomy is perhaps the most popular of Kitty Horrorshow's games, and I think a lot of that has to do with the game's comparative accessibility. Much of Kitty Horrorshow's games lean hard into the alt games philosophy. They tend to be small, short, personal projects that celebrate glitches and bugs as a core aesthetic value rather than as a defect. But more than that, it's the embrace of occasionally obtuse and abstract imagery, a lack of straightforward or self-explanatory game mechanics or direction, and a general aversion to user-friendliness that tends to render these games somewhat opaque to a lot of players. And it's not the sort of alienating design that's the result of an accident or an oversight. The games are often designed this way for a reason. Look at Grandmother, which is capped at 18 frames a second with a narrow field of view and a slow turning speed. On one hand, this mimics the old first-person point-and-click games from DOS, and on the other, it ratchets up the tension by making controls feel unresponsive and your view limited. And that's one of the more tame examples. Heck, this game has a virtually unpronounceable title, and that's coming from a guy who has played and enjoyed VVV, and continue 98765432110. Even better, the game actually comes bundled so deep in a sea of folders with nonsense names that the game won't launch on some systems until it's been extracted out from under them. Which makes sense for a game that confesses that it does not want you there, that you are a trespasser who has forced their way in. Again, these are not accidents, they are games that embrace dysfunction and a rejection of traditional game values intentionally. But don't be fooled into thinking it's just a bunch of impossible-to-run gimmick games. Kitty Horrorshow's oeuvre has some really consistent themes and ideas. Horror and dread run deep in her work, but it's rarely a product of ghosts or monsters that chase you down and give you a game over. Body horror, in particular, is a recurring theme, with disembodied organs and fluids often having a mind of their own. But above everything else, her work seems to be centered on the perversion and corruption of spaces thought to be safe, or maybe even pedestrian. City streets, a happy-ish trapper-keeper-esque fantasy realm, an old farm, a regular suburban home. These aren't places we normally find nightmare-ish, they're places where nightmares invade. Michael Myers comes to your house, or you stumble onto a farm where Leatherface has set up his shop, but the house and the farm aren't usually the problem. But in Kitty Horrorshow's works, the places themselves are what are wrong and terrifying. Her works don't have evil ghosts or evil demons, they have evil spaces that hide their malevolence in plain sight. And while that rings true from the discomforting farmhouse and Grandmother, all the way through to the ominous pyramid that one day arrived in Chyzra,
we spent months in the pyramid's great shadow. Not foraging or sculpting or scavenging as we always had, simply basking in the warmth and comfort it gave us, letting the skin peel on our arms and our legs, smiling at the sky as we grew weak and complacent.
It's Anatomy that really embraces this concept and fleshes it out fully and in a way that mostly sidesteps a lot of the accessibility issues in her other games. So, Anatomy. So far we've been talking at a pretty high level about Kitty Horrorshow's overall works, but I think if we're really going to dig into Anatomy, we need to really dig, and that means going through pretty much the whole game. So if you want to play it, I definitely recommend checking it out before finishing this video. It's a great little horror piece. That out of the way, it's astounding how scary this game can be despite having no monsters, ghouls, or zombies. Well, scary might not even be the right word. I mean, there's jump scare scary. And then there's the instinctual fear of predators or being prey. And then there's cosmic terror and the fear that all you know is wrong. And then there's dread. Unlike those other types of scares, dread doesn't necessarily come from a specific threat or have a specific reason. Dread is the feeling of your guts turning into knots, sure in your heart that something's wrong, but not able to put your finger on it just yet. Anatomy is dreadful, and I mean that in the best possible way. The structure of Anatomy is actually pretty straightforward. You find yourself in a dark, mostly empty house. In the kitchen, you'll find a tape recorder that plays an ominous message about the nature of houses, and from there the game leads you from room to room to collect additional tapes.
But of all the structures that mankind has invented for itself, there is little doubt that the house is that which it relies upon most completely for its continued survival.
And that's pretty much it from a design perspective. But it works. As the player, you have a pretty clearly defined goal for making progress, and it lets the game deliver its narrative as you go. The formula really isn't all that different from Horrorshow's Chyzra, but where that game takes place in a dying village surrounded by onyx monoliths with a concrete body horror story, no pun intended, Anatomy hits a little bit closer to home. Okay, pun intended that time. Anyways, as you collect tapes, you hear about how homes are, at least in some loose metaphorical sense, analogous to human bodies, with rooms that perform functions not entirely dissimilar to organs.
The anatomy of the house is such that this analogy is less superficial than at first it may seem. To carry it further, if we were to dissect a house as we might a human cadaver, we would find ourselves able to isolate and describe its various appendages and their functions in a decidedly anatomical fashion. There is even a fair number of direct comparisons to be drawn between those organs of a house and those of a human body.
There's an immediate sense of ill-ease, from the warped voice coming through the tapes to the sound of doors unlocking by themselves in the distance as you get instructions about where to go next. At first, it's tempting to just attribute the game's creepiness to the darkness. Standing in a poorly lit hallway in dead silence can spook anybody out a little bit. And really, the game's first act is about as creepy as whatever you can imagine being in the shadows with you, which could be a lot or not very much depending on your disposition. After the players have collected most of the tapes, there's this wonderful little fake-out where the basement is built up to be the place of nightmares, but it's ultimately revealed that the bedrooms are typically the truly horrific rooms of a home. This culminates with the first real deception of the house. You walk into the master bedroom, find a tape, and then you realize the door to the hallway has disappeared. In its place is another tape recorder waiting for you to put the tape in.
Each night we shut our senses to the world for hours at a time, trusting in the house to keep us safe until next we wake. In this state of extreme vulnerability, we will spend something like 20% of our lives. Anything might stand beside us, watch us, keep us company until dawn, and we would never perceive it. The bedroom seems less like a mind and more like a mouth, for it is here that the house is most likely to betray us. It is here that we place ourselves most at the house's mercy, and spend each night hoping that it will not bite down.
And then the game closes. It's one of the ways the game seems to generate tension. As a player, you can't die and a monster jumps out and eats you sense, but you can certainly stop existing and have the game go away. It's also the way the game denotes its acts. Each one ends with a death, if you want to call it that, of the player, and to continue you need to boot the game back up again. And each time you do, the corruption of the house has set in a little bit deeper. With the next cycle, the VHS quality has started to degrade and the audio design begins doing a lot of the heavy lifting, and glitches become more prevalent. Again, you seek out tapes, but now their messages are warped and corroded.
Why do human beings of our modern age foster this tremendous sympathy?
The cassette models become distorted and veiny connective tissue starts to appear in certain rooms. Even the instructional text begins to decay, like the game itself is struggling just to hold together. And the second act has some fun creepy bits, but it's at the end of the second act that the game reveals that the voices on the tapes have either started to become, or have always been, the internal monologue of the house itself.
In the bedroom. Joe.
I dream that there are teeth growing all over me, everywhere on me and in me, like cysts or bone spurs. I look out through the bedroom window and I see a truck approaching. A young man steps out, approaches and enters through the front door. He goes to the basement and stands at the top of the stairs. I'm angry at him, so I slam the door and he falls down. I can feel his bones snapping.
It then tells you about a hapless intruder it lured into the basement before Act 2 ends. As you start Act 3, the house is no longer passively creepy, but actively malevolent. The house has become a character in its own right so slowly you might not have even noticed, but it has now grown to resent you. You begin to realize that there is a monster in Anatomy, and you can't run from it. It's already swallowed you. The space has become even less recognizable as a boring 3-bedroom house. The building becomes a subversion of itself. A place originally Spartanly decorated but otherwise relatable is rendered as a mess of misplaced objects, Z-fighting textures, and scrambled 3D meshes, all while the house breathes and its heart beats. Familiar items become duplicated or are placed in impossible ways and positions that in other games are just kind of funny level design errors, but here belie a shattered reality. The glitchy, not quite right look of badly designed games intentionally used by titles like Goat Simulator to elicit laughs, here are used to provoke and discomfort. Like I said last week, Oxenfree does something similar with its glitches, but I don't think it's as successful. What Anatomy manages to do is to sow distrust with the game itself. Doors open to reveal a second broken door. Other doors have stretched and become the wrong size to operate at all. Walls vibrate as textures fight to be on top of one another. Rooms that had objects no longer have objects. Rooms that had objects now have too many objects. Between that and the game's frequent self-closing, the world feels fragile and unreliable. There's a tension simply existing in this space. Meanwhile, Oxenfree's time jumps produced some degree of an unreliable narrator in Alex's point of view with events that may or may not have taken place, but at no point do we sense the glitchiness of the game itself as a threat. It's mostly an excuse to throw up creepy images on the screen, which contributes to tone, but the glitchiness is sort of an incidental framing device for the creepy imagery. In Anatomy, the glitchiness isn't delivering scary content, but is itself presented as a scary decomposition of the game world as you're playing it. And I think what sells that is the transformation of this space. It started as something familiar and welcoming, just framed in a creepy darkness, but is now alien and in a way unknowable, but above all untrustworthy. And that's one of the two themes that run throughout the game, this idea that we put entirely too much trust in our homes. The game attempts to highlight the amount of faith we put into these buildings we live in. They guard us while we sleep, they're there for our most intimate moments, they facilitate our biological functions. We don't just put a lot of trust into our houses, we are utterly dependent on them to survive. And that concept itself is somewhat existentially scary, that we need these shells, these protectors. We build these sanctuaries to ourselves in the way we live our lives, but how much of our lives do their form and function dictate back to us? Anyways, after the player descends into the basement and is consumed by the house for a third and final time, there are about 4 scenes that could potentially get played at random, and all of them push much harder into the abstract imagery than the rest of the game. My favorite one, though, has got to be the one where you can't help but wander your way back to the house after passing rows of identical homes, sort of hammering home the universal nature of the game's themes. Like the game's tagline says, every house is haunted. Though the scariest scene is probably the throwback to... yeah, that. The next time you boot the game, you get the monologue that cold opened this episode, and it's in that epilogue combined with a few other snippets that frame the house as surprisingly sympathetic. I mean, yeah, it's an evil house that tries to kill you and eat you multiple times, don't get me wrong, but the end of the game reframes its cruel spirit as desperately, violently lonely. "You Never Came Back" is displayed in tracking font on the red VHS tape, both in the living room and before the final scene, and the timestamp on the first VHS tape at the game's open suggests they were recorded in 1994, which would explain the CRT TV and the tape cassettes and the VHS tapes. This is a house that has been seemingly abandoned and without residents for 20 years. And then there's that monologue at the very end of the game.
How does it regard those creatures who built it? Brought it into existence only to abandon it? It may stare for long hours into the darkness of its own empty halls and see shadows. And its heart may jump as it thinks, here's someone again, I'm not alone. And each time it is wrong. And the hurt starts over. It may haunt itself, inventing ghosts to walk its floors.
I don't think it's out of the question to suggest that the player avatars were those ghosts, or at least that they could be. Maybe we weren't literal people walking into a random house and getting eaten in the middle of the night. Maybe we are the house, experiencing itself, ghosts conjured up by a building trying to find meaning and lashing out when there's none to be found. It hungers and imagines its vengeance while slowly decaying on a curb somewhere. Anatomy is a haunted house tale, sure, but it's also a tale of abandonment and isolation, and in a weird way the real terror is the houses, for its suffering does not end. Look, I'm sure there are some of you out there that would find a horror game without a monster jumping out at you not scary or even kind of boring, and I'm also pretty sure there's a large contingent of my audience that is incredulous at best about the idea that houses, even metaphorically, can have feelings. But seriously, give the game a shot. It's $3, it's a great lesson in environmental and audio design for horror, and it's definitely not like most other video game horror stuff out there. Or at least check out some of Kitty Horrorshow's other free titles. After all, 'tis the season.